In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, people lived a lot more closely with death than we do today. Mortality rates were much higher. Wakes were held in the family home. And relics of the dead, such as death photographs and hair jewelry, were kept as prized possessions after the wake had ended. Perhaps it's not surprising, then, that from this time came the religion of spiritualism, which was based on the belief that the spirits of the dead were not only here, in this world, but could even communicate with you, if you had the right skill set. Spiritualism was fairly widespread in the late 1800s, and interest in the paranormal was at an all-time high. Skepticism was also at an all-time high. Cashing in on this divide, newspapers printed a wide variety of ghost stories and paranormal investigations. On this episode, join me as we explore just a few of these ghastly tales from the pages of historic Indiana newspapers. I'm Lindsay Beckley, and this is Talking Hoosier History. Before we get to the eerie escapades of this episode, I wanted to give a bit of a warning. We'll be exploring some rather spooky subjects today, and there will be violence, and there will be murder. If those topics make you uncomfortable, perhaps you should turn back now and join us again next episode. Otherwise, welcome. Most ghost stories start with death, and our first terrifying tale is no exception. The Logansport Journal brought us reports of a patricide in Galveston, Cass County on September 9, 1895. The early afternoon calm of Galveston was ripped away in an instant as gunshots emanated from the home of Daniel Kemp, one of the oldest and most well-respected men of the small town. Daniel's son Frank, who had lost both legs in an accident and so used a hand-operated tricycle to get around, fetched a doctor. The doctor attended the scene and found not only had Daniel been shot, he had also been bludgeoned in the head. The good doctor did everything he could for the wounded man, but it was in vain. The injury proved to be fatal. In the meantime, the ugly truth came to light. It had been Frank, Daniel's own son, who pulled the trigger after quarreling with his father over money. The body was removed and buried. Frank was taken away in chains to be tried for the murder of his father. Time passed. Lives went on. Over a year later, this tragic event reared its head several miles away in Logansport, the county seat of Cass County. On February 3, 1897, newspaper headlines announced that, quote, a ghostly shape haunts the catacombs of the courthouse. In that very courthouse, a year and a half before, Frank Kemp had been found guilty of murder and sentenced to 3 years in prison. 2 grisly reminders of this case sat in the basement of the courthouse, forgotten after the trial. The hand-operated tricycle which Frank Kemp had used to fetch the doctor that fateful day, and the cudgel that he had used to bludgeon his father's head, still stained with blood. The night watchman for the courthouse had made it his habit to eat lunch in the basement each night. He knew the murderous story behind the relics stashed away in the basement, and there's little doubt that the brutal scene of that September day came to mind every time he saw it, only to be brushed aside as superstition. That is, until one fateful night. He was sitting there with the bright glow
of an electric lamp over his head. You could hear the footsteps of the janitor. Beyond the bright light of the boiler room, there was darkness, black, impenetrable, save for the feeble ray of light reflected from the windows of the journal office over the way. The shadows were blackest where reposed the mementos of murder, and he looked with an apprehensive shiver towards this spot. There appeared to him the moving shape of a human being. Involuntarily, he held his breath. With a sharp intake of air, which was more like a gasp, he half rose in his chair, his eyes opened to their widest, and his hair stood out in obstreperous points all over his head. The figure advanced with silent tread, weaving about from side to side as if mortally hurt, and, reaching the dim reflected light from the windows across the way, paused a moment as if for consideration. The figure was that of an old man, his shoulders stooped, his head crowned with silvery locks. His patriarchal beard swept his breast as he moved his head toward the speechless watcher, and his eyes glowed in their sunken sockets with a fire that was supernatural. Tom could stand no more. With a yell that roused the workers in the room above, he dashed for a window to escape from the dreadful shape.
Others saw that same figure in the following nights, but none were able to explain what they saw. It was widely believed that this was the ghost of Daniel Kemp, haunting the space where those grisly relics of his murder were being stored. Our next phantom-filled fable is from the Logansport Reporter. The tale begins on February 18, 1899.
Thornhope, a little village northwest of Logansport, is all agog over a remarkable ghost story, the details of which were made public but yesterday.
On February 16, 1868, John Bear set out on foot from Thornhope, Cass County, to Star City in Pulaski County to purchase several head of cattle. In order to conduct his business, he was carrying $3,000. That's nearly $90,000 today. Somewhere between his home and that of a friend, where he was planning to stop on his way out of town, Bear disappeared without a trace. That is, until exactly 30 years later, when Gabriel Fickle was walking along that same path that John Bear had traveled 3 decades before.
As he was returning from Royal Center to his home via the railroad, he dimly descried a form approaching as he neared the old water tank. The figure was walking slowly, and as Fickle approached it, it stopped in front of him. Fickle crossed to the other side of the track, and the figure did likewise at the same time, extending a hand and exclaiming, "Why, Gabe, don't you know me?" Fickle replied negatively, but put forth his hand to shake hands with the friendly stranger when, to his horror, he found himself grasping thin air, although in other respects the apparition was lifelike. Before Fickle could make an effort to speak, the specter further frightened him by continuing, "I am the ghost of John Bear, murdered on this spot 30 years ago tonight." Fickle declares he was seized with the most abject fear. His hair stood on end, his throat was parched, and strive as he would, not a sound came from his lips. He tottered past the vision of the dead, but the latter followed.
Fickle screwed up his courage and asked the entity how he met his death. The ghost confirmed that he had been murdered for the money he carried, and stated that those guilty of the egregious crime were still living in the area. The specter then demanded that Fickle not speak a word of this encounter for exactly 1 year. Fickle, eager to be gone, gave his word and fled the site. 1 year later, his account was published by the reporter, lacking one important detail: the identity of the murderers. Fickle explained that the ghosts had not yet given him the names of the guilty parties, but he assured them that he would attempt to meet the spirit again, and this time he would demand to know who among the townspeople had murder in their hearts. Before that could happen, though, the apparition appeared in front of a railroad worker and said,
"Tell Thornhope people that my bones are crying out for vengeance, and they are the instruments through which my murderers are to be brought to justice."
However, the ghost must not have been too keen for justice, because even after several conversations with Fickle, spanning the next year, the ghost of Bear still refused to reveal the names. Yet, even as late as April of 1900, newspapers reported that the truth was forthcoming.
Gabe Fickle of Thornhope claims to have had another visit from John Bear's ghost, warning him to keep a compact to meet the specter at an old well at midnight, when the names of Bear's murderers will be divulged. Fickle hesitates about going to the well alone and can induce no one to go with him. The ghost threatens to haunt him all his life if he does not keep the appointment.
Whether or not he attended that last meeting, we'll never know, as the Thornhope ghost, or indeed the names of Gabe Fickle and John Bear, never appear in the pages of newspapers after that. Our next tale is about another justice-seeking shade, only this time, he's not in pursuit of those who caused his death. Rather, he's looking to safeguard his legacy. This story can be found in the July 19th, 1914 issue of the Indianapolis Star. James Wickham served as governor of Indiana from 1843 to 1848. He was once described as, quote, one of the most cautious and timid men in the world. The same could not be said of his ghost. Upon his death in 1852, Wickham left his large, eclectic library to Indiana Asbury University, now DePaul University, in Greencastle, Indiana. He apparently put little faith in the security of the library because, instead of spending his afterlife in paradise, or roaming the halls of his home, or tormenting his enemies, he took to haunting the stacks. His will specified that the books in his collection were strictly for reference and were not to go into circulation. But mistakes were made, and on a few occasions, a book was allowed to leave the doors of that stately institution. Each bibliotransgression incurred the wrath of the wraith. The governor's ghost hunted down each tome like a hound. The article says that there were several different instances of book-related hauntings on campus, but one in particular stood out among the others. A freshman, browsing the books of the Whitcomb collection, happened across one in particular that caught his eye. A rather old volume, with a faded cover bearing the name The Poems of Ossian. The book, written in the mid-1760s, is purportedly a collection of ancient Scottish folklore, collected by James Macpherson. It was also Governor Wickham's favorite tome.
This book the freshman carefully slipped into his pocket and carried away. That night the freshman buried himself in the weird lore of this 18th century poet until long past the midnight hour. Before retiring, he carefully concealed the stolen treasure beneath his pillow. He turned out the light, retired, and for a considerable time lay listening to the intermittent noises of the night, made vastly weird by the thoughts his reading had induced. A midnight visitor suddenly stood at the foot of the startled student's bed. Although no door hinge had squeaked, the vapor figure in the habiliments of the coffin loomed gigantic against the black background of the room. A menacing arm protruded from the shroud and pointed at the student, who, moved by fright, crowded against the headboard and imagined he felt the fingertips of the uncanny intruder brush his face. He threw his arm over his head as if to ward off the blow. Fright had paralyzed his tongue. Then in cavernous voice spoke the ghost. "Ossian, Ossian, who stole Ossian?"
The words were repeated again and again as the young man lay frozen in fear. After some time, the apparition, along with its accusing words, faded into the darkness. He spent a sleepless night waiting for the library to open its doors the following morning, and was the first patron of the day. Not all ghosts have such a specific purpose behind their ghastly wanderings. Take, for example, This account from the Muncie Evening Press from July 31st, 1905. Residents of Flaherty's Siding, near LaPorte, upon arriving at the nearby train station, would see nothing out of the ordinary, unless, that is, they were arriving after sunset. Then they would see, well, a ghost, of course.
Headless, and acting for all the world like an animate thing, the apparition occurs intermittently. It makes its appearance with unfailing regularity, and standing on the platform with dinner pail in hand, it swings its arms back and forth as if it were flagging an approaching train. Then it disappears, and in disappearing frequently gives unearthly shrieks, as though suffering terrible pain.
It was widely believed that the phantom was the spirit of Columbus Cole.
Cole, who was a well-known and popular resident of the vicinity of Flaherty's, was run over by an engine within a few feet of the spot where the water tank stands. In the accident, his head was completely severed from his body.
Some of the young men of the town, dubious of the claims, set off to reveal the ghost as some sort of hoax or trick of the imagination. Their first night of investigation resulted in nothing but a lack of sleep. Nary the shadow of a ghost was glimpsed. The second night, however, was a different story. As one of the young men reported,
"Reaching the station early in the evening, we prepared to take things easy, for we felt sure no ghost would be seen. However, we had hardly been there an hour when one of the boys raised his hand and cried, 'Hush!' We looked, and right before us, and but a short distance from the old water tank, we saw a strange apparition, a form, headless and carrying a dinner pail. It was the ghost, and not a delusion of the eyesight. We could plainly see the real, clear outline of Columbus Cole as we knew him in life, and it was even the same dinner pail that he invariably carried to and from his work. For 5 minutes or more, we watched the apparition as its arms swung back and forth. Presently, as if spurred on by one united impulse, we rushed to the spot where we had seen the headless figure. But upon reaching the spot, nothing but vacancy greeted us. Cole's ghost had entirely disappeared, and we stood and looked at one another in silence, marveling at the supernatural incident. But our curiosity had been satisfied, and we were no longer skeptics, but believers.
This apparition, unlike others we have covered, seemed not to realize that it had passed from the realm of the living. Columbus Cole was there, waving down the train that would kill him, for years after his death. That's all the time we have for ghost stories. We'll be back next month with more Hoosier history, this time without the haunts. I'm Lindsay Beckley, and this has been Talking Hoosier History. Talking Hoosier History is a product of the Indiana Historical Bureau, a division of the Indiana State Library. THH is written by me, Lindsay Beckley. Production and sound engineering by Jill Weiss Simmons. The voice of newspapers on the show is Justin Clark, project assistant for Hoosier State Chronicles, Indiana's digital historic newspaper program. Find more alarming anecdotes of the supernatural from the pages of historic newspapers at newspapers.library.in.gov. To see the sources for this episode and all of our episodes, go to blog.history.in.gov and click on Talking Hoosier History at the top. Keep up with us on Facebook at Talking Hoosier History or on Twitter at @TalkHoosierHist. Subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.